Hello and welcome to our program. My name is Dr. Bernie Fershpan, and I am a member of the Board of Directors and an educator here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County, located in Glen Cove, New York. We have what I think is a very interesting program this morning with HMTC's Scholar in Residence, Dr. Linda Burghardt, who is going to speak about the Kindertransport and the way this remarkable rescue operation was able to save 10,000 children in the Holocaust. Before I introduce our speaker, however, I would like to tell you that we offer a wide variety of programs in person and on Zoom here at HMTC, and you can find details about our programs on our website, hmtcli.org. That's hmtcli.org. Just go to the website and click on the Events tab. During the presentation today, please put your questions and comments in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as we can at the end. And if you don't mind, it would be interesting if you would put your location in the chat as well. Okay, let me get to today's program now. And for that, I'll stop sharing the screen and ask our speaker, Dr. Linda Burghardt, to come on. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Bernie.
I am very pleased to introduce you, Dr. Burghardt, our scholar in residence at HMTC, and a journalist and author, and someone I count on as a friend. Dr. Burghardt worked as a freelance reporter for the New York Times for 20 years and is the author of 3 nonfiction books. Her articles and essays have appeared in newspapers across the U.S. and overseas, most recently the Times of Israel, and she has lectured to both national and international audiences. She holds a PhD from Long Island University and is the daughter of Holocaust survivors from Vienna. Dr. Burghardt has presented a number of powerful presentations with us over the years, and today she will be speaking about the Kindertransport, which operated in Germany and Austria in the early years of the Holocaust. I am very grateful for Linda's work at HMTC, and I am delighted to welcome her to our virtual stage. Linda?
Thank you, Bernie. That was a very nice introduction. Good. So I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about the Kindertransport and the remarkable rescue that saved 10,000 children in the Holocaust. So I'll just share my screen now. I'll start with a little bit of background about the Kindertransport, and it's a story that has many aspects to it. There's love and war, betrayal and trust, and at bottom, the things that we're willing to do to protect our beloved children. And even though it happened many years ago, it never runs out of relevance to our world today. So the basic issue is this: what happens when our children are threatened and we can't shield them from danger? So how do we make this terrible, critical decision about whether to keep them with us or send them out of our arms and into the unknown? So the tragic history of the Holocaust does have at least one bright light, and that's the Kindertransport, the unique and highly successful program designed to rescue children who were in mortal danger in war-torn, Nazi-dominated countries in the early days of the Holocaust in 1938. And we say the early days because no one knew for sure what would happen. Of course, no one knew the extent of the danger, and no one yet knew how to keep the children safe. But what actually inspired the creation of the Kindertransport? This is a huge operation that cost a great deal of money and involves thousands of people. So to explain it a little bit, 2 events took place in quick succession to set the Kindertransport in motion. And these 2 events led to an epiphany for the parents caught and held under Nazi domination. So emigration was already nearly impossible in 1938, when Hitler's iron fist closed tightly around the Jews in Germany and Austria. In Vienna, as we see in this picture here, Nazis forcibly blocked residents from even entering the foreign consulates to try to gain visas to get out of the country. So the 2 events I will tell you about made the people see the danger from which most of them had been averting their eyes for months, hoping that it would simply pass as it had done in many other years. But while they averted their eyes, this happened so often, hoping that the bad times would simply melt away, the Nazi hate campaign against the Jews had deepened and grown, and now pushed its tentacles of terror further and further into society, and finally into the homes of the Jews in Hitler's grip. And then the first event happened, and it was this: a man named Ernst von Roth, a member of the German nobility, a Nazi party member, and a relatively minor German Foreign Office diplomat. He was stationed in the German embassy in Paris. And on November 7th, 1938, it's an important date, during his regular duties, he was suddenly attacked by a young man with a gun. So the young man with the gun was a Jewish teenager from Berlin named Herschel Greenspan. The Nazis had expelled his Jewish parents from Berlin and deported them to Poland, along with thousands of others, where they would perish. And the shooting was an open act of revenge against the Nazis and a scream of protest against what had happened to Greenspan's parents. And the shot from Greenspan's gun unleashed nothing less than utter hell across Europe. When von Roth died in the days that followed, he became a celebrated martyr. And propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who we see here, said loudly that the Nazis would not quash any spontaneous protests that happened to arise against the Jews, who were blamed when von Roth died. Earlier in the year, in July, when it became increasingly apparent that no country wanted the Jews, who were desperate to emigrate, as we know, international diplomats from 32 countries, at the instigation of the US, gathered at a town in France, Evian, a resort town, Evian, where the water comes from. And they got together to discuss what they perceived as the growing crisis of German and Austrian refugees trying mightily to flee persecution from Hitler's government. Now, remember, this is 1938, so this is before World War II officially started, before Poland was attacked. So it was Germany and Austria where the people were in the most danger. But tragically, after much discussion, days of discussion, almost no country, including the US, was willing to give visas to the desperate European Jews to enable them to emigrate to their countries. Only the Dominican Republic, interestingly, opened its gates. It didn't open it all that widely. Everyone who went there on a visa would have to farm for 7 years, but people took it. It was a way to get out. So clearly, the European Jews were trapped. And then came Kristallnacht, the second and final event that opened the eyes of every parent in Nazi-occupied Europe to the mortal danger that they and their children were in. Ernst von Roth's death by a Jewish gunman became the excuse for the state-sponsored 2-day-long terror attack on the Jews in Germany and Austria that became known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, or as it is known today, the November 9th pogrom. Kristallnacht was a name given to that night by the Nazis, and recently it's been thought better to have a name that is named by the Jews. And so it is now the November 9th pogrom, even though people still refer to it as Kristallnacht. So the ferocity of the pre-war persecution of the Jews and the fact that no country would take them reached its pinnacle with the pogrom. German and Austrian Nazis subjected thousands of Jews who could not escape to violence and sadistic torture. Nearly 30,000 Jewish men, 30,000, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And they even had to suffer small but serious humiliations along the way. You see in this picture, these men don't have hats on their heads. And this is 1938. No one left the house without a hat, especially the men, the Homburgs, the fedoras, the trilbies. And you can see in their left hand, they're often holding them down up next to their hips. The Nazis would not let them wear their hats. It was a small humiliation, but a very serious one as they marched down the street with the enormous Jewish star in the front. So in the pogrom, 270 synagogues were destroyed with Torah scrolls unrolled, stomped upon, torn into pieces, and then set on fire. Community buildings where Jewish meetings and events took place were torched and burned. And the large glass windows of tens of thousands of Jewish shops were violently shattered, the contents of the shops looted. Yet the world remained silent, watching Hitler's military strength increase troop by troop, weapon by weapon. The flags here say Deutschland erwache, which means Germany, wake up. Scholars all over the world called Kristallnacht a harbinger for the Holocaust. Now I'll tell you a family story. These are my parents, Hilda and Siegfried, Friedel, as he was known in Austria, Fred, once he came to the US. Now, they were in Vienna at the time of Kristallnacht, where they were born and had lived all their lives. They were newly married and in their 20s, and they heard the beginnings of the devastation in their home, and they tried to hide. But my father was arrested and taken to Dachau, one of the first concentration camps, actually formed already in 1933, very early. It's right outside of Munich. So my mother recalls how the Nazis broke into the apartment, stole their jewelry, and cut up their feather beds, throwing the down out the window. So it started looking like on the streets, it was raining snow. Not only were the men taken away and the women and the children terrorized, but the message was clear: you are not safe anywhere, even in the privacy of your own home. Nowhere is safe, nothing is sacred. My mother was able to get my father released after a few days because she had papers to get them both to America. Passports, visas, steamship tickets, everything was ready. She went there waving them, and she was able to get him out. Sometimes that happened early on like this, but most of the men arrested that night were not so fortunate. Many perished in Dachau. Some families eventually received a small box containing the ashes of someone they had once loved. Others were sent to Auschwitz and worked to death or immediately gassed, which is what happened to my grandparents, who could not get out of Nazi-controlled Austria. And so the fire was lit within the Jewish community to act. The first effort to save at least the children was set into motion, and the planning for the Kindertransport was begun. The ferocity and the unbridled evil of Kristallnacht had galvanized rescue efforts in Great Britain. On November 15th, 1938, just 5 days after the devastation of the Night of Broken Glass, and just 7 days after the murder of von Roth, in Germany and Austria, a delegation of British, Jewish, and Quaker leaders appealed in person to the Prime Minister of the UK, Neville Chamberlain, and he was willing to listen. The already existing refugee aid committees had done a 180-degree turn, switching into high gear and changing their focus from immigration to rescue, acknowledging the emergency nature of the danger. The Central British Fund for Germany had been established in 1933. That's the year, of course, when Hitler took power, and is the beginning of the Holocaust, the official first year of the 12-year Holocaust. And they tried to support in whatever way possible the needs of the Jews in Germany and Austria. And now there was a new way. So the delegation requested that the British government permit the temporary admission of unaccompanied Jewish children. These are children who would not only have to travel alone without their parents, but remain in the UK on their own with no family. The British cabinet debated the issue, and the next day began to prepare a bill to present to Parliament. The bill stated that the government would waive certain immigration requirements so as to allow the entry into Great Britain of unaccompanied children ranging from infants to the age of 17, but only under certain conditions. Always conditions, right? The children were to come from the German Reich, which at the time consisted of Germany, Austria, which had been annexed in March of 1938 in the Anschluss, and parts of Czechoslovakia, to enter the UK as refugees. One condition was that the children would not be granted a path to citizenship. Another was that they would be required to emigrate back to the countries from which they came once the war was over. Although by the time the war ended, nearly all the parents from whom the children were taken were no longer alive. Often the children would be the only members of their families to survive. But of course, no one knew that at this time. So despite the conditions, in the debate to determine whether the bill would pass, it was reported that inquiries in Germany had determined that nearly every person asked had said they would be willing to send their children unaccompanied to the UK, leaving their parents behind. The timing was good for Parliament to ask for this monumental law to be passed. The British Colonial Office had just turned down the Jewish Agency's separate request to allow the admission of 10,000 Jewish children to enter British-controlled Palestine, a decision that caused significant anger and fear. But Parliament was swayed to pass the bill for four good reasons. First, this infuriating refusal to allow children to emigrate to Palestine. Second, the atrocities in Germany and Austria. Third, the untiring persistence of the refugee advocates. And finally, some very useful sympathy for Jews in some very high places. We can hear this in the words of British Foreign Minister Samuel Hoare, delivered in a speech to Parliament. Here is a chance of taking the young generation of a great people. Here is a chance of mitigating to some extent the terrible suffering of their parents and their friends. It was agreed to admit the children on temporary travel documents. No passport was required. This made it much easier. The children were to travel in sealed trains with adult chaperones who were required to return immediately to their home cities. Anyone who tried to stay would jeopardize the entire transport of children, which would be sent back immediately. But where did the money come from to do all of this? Private citizens and various organizations were tasked with the chore of raising the funds to guarantee payment for each child's care, for each child's education, and for each child's eventual immigration back to their home country from Britain. A 50 pound sterling bond, which in today's rates is just under $5,000, had to be posted for each child to assure that none of the refugees would become a financial burden on the public and to ensure their ultimate resettlement. Most of the funding for the rescue operation came from the Central British Fund for German Jewry, an organization that is still active today, known as World Jewish Relief. When the Kindertransport program was being created in the UK, sympathy for the children who had become targets of the Nazis grew overseas due to the strong publicity efforts of the Jewish community. In the US, efforts were underway to create a similar program in which America would save many additional Jewish children endangered by the brutal Nazi government policies. Legislation called the Wagner-Rogers Bill was introduced in Congress the same year that Kindertransport was established, asking to increase the official quota of European immigrants, a quota which was unfortunately extremely low, considering the number of desperate Europeans who needed to emigrate to save their lives. The bill, if passed, would have brought a total of 20,000 unaccompanied Jewish children, refugees under the age of 14 from Nazi Germany and its occupied territories. The bill was sponsored by Senator Robert F. Wagner, a Democrat from New York. And if the name sounds familiar, his son became mayor of New York City years later, and Representative Edith Rogers, a Republican from Massachusetts. The reason the bill was proposed for children only, with no accompanying adults, was to assuage widespread fears that adult refugees would take away jobs from Americans, from resident Americans, most of whom were still struggling in the Depression. The bill had widespread support among religious and labor groups, like the AFL-CIO, but was opposed by nationalist organizations. In contrast to the regulations for the Kindertransport legislation, where the British government waived visa requirements for immigration, the children who would be helped by the US program were offered no visa assurance. They were offered no visa assistance. And even for adults, the State Department made it very difficult for any Jewish refugee to obtain an entrance visa. Senator Rice Reynolds, a Democrat from North Carolina, who was an avid isolationist, it's 1938, threatened to filibuster against it. A filibuster, as you know, is a political procedure in which a member of a legislative body prolongs debate on a bill to delay or entirely prevent a decision. It is sometimes called talking a bill to death. The president favored the bill and lent it his support, but he believed he lacked the wherewithal to overcome congressional resistance. Eleanor Roosevelt, a deep humanitarian at heart, also expressed support for the bill, but went as far as lobbying for it. Sorry, I'm looking at Rice Reynolds lobbying against it. A poll by the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker group, found that 35 senators were in favor of the bill, 34 were probably in favor, pretty good odds. These votes might have sufficed for the bill to pass, but the House Immigration Committee did not allow the bill to leave the committee. There was certainly general anti-immigration sentiment at the time, but no doubt anti-Semitism played a significant role in the defeat of the bill. Tragically, the chance to save 20,000 children failed. But in other parts of the world, national sentiment resulted in different outcomes. In Sweden, for example, the Jewish community of Stockholm negotiated with the government for an exception to the country's restrictive policy on Jewish refugees to take in 500 Jewish children. Temporary residence permits were granted on the condition that the parents would not try to enter the country. Of course, they would want to. However, they could not. In Holland, 1,500 children were admitted, supported by the Dutch Committee for Jewish Refugees. Now, Sir Nicholas Winton, I'm sure you've heard of him. He was a British Jewish stockbroker who was a major force in the rescue of 699 endangered children from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia in what became known as the Czech Kindertransport, different from the official British Kindertransport from Germany and Austria, but outstanding and a tremendous help. He was called the British Schindler, and he explained he was just acting on his primary philosophy of life, which was this: don't be content in life to do no wrong. Be prepared every day to try to do some good. Nevertheless, in Great Britain, the Kindertransport rescue operation was moving full steam ahead. By late November of 1938, just 2 weeks after Kristallnacht, British citizens heard an appeal for foster homes on the ubiquitous BBC Home Service radio station, as the agencies had to provide homes for the children once they emigrated. Soon there were hundreds of offers, and volunteers representing the refugee children's movement started visiting potential future foster homes in all parts of the UK and reporting on the conditions they found there. The organizers did not insist that the homes for Jewish children be Jewish homes, and the families differed greatly. Some were small, some had many children already, nor did they probe too deeply into the motives or the character of the families. It was sufficient that the houses looked clean and the families seemed respectable. But before the children could go, the organizers had to individually go and ask the Nazis for permission to let the children leave. After much arguing, they agreed, as long as the children took no valuables out of the country. Offices were set up in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague to speed this along. Now, volunteers from the Jewish relief agencies went to the major cities in Germany and Austria to establish systems for choosing, organizing, and transporting the children. Priority was given to children who were in danger of arrest or deportation. Some were in Jewish orphanages, others were living in partially destroyed homes with parents who were too impoverished or traumatized to keep them. Some of the children were already on their own, since their parents had been arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps and had been forced to abandon their children, whom the Nazis sometimes actually left behind. But most came from middle-class homes like this one, where the parents' only crime was being Jewish. These kids were just regular kids. Now, parents viewed the Kindertransport as a last resort, of course, choosing to send their children away only if they felt they were in severe mortal danger from the increasingly violent Nazi persecution. Many parents feared that their children would not survive in Austria and Germany, and they grasped at this last chance, painful and terrifying as it was. Most of the transports left from central gathering places in Berlin, Vienna, or Prague. Children from smaller towns or villages traveled from their homes to these collection points at the train stations in order to join the transports. So who were the kids on the transports? So the children's ages ranged from infants to teenagers up to the age of 17 and came from a variety of social, political, and cultural backgrounds. Some were from Orthodox households. Many were assimilated Jews who only attended synagogue on the high holidays. Some did not even consider themselves Jewish. Others were labeled as non-Aryans, as they had converted to Christianity. Although, as we know, Hitler declared that Judaism was a race and not a nation or an ethnicity or even a religion, and thus attempts to identify as a non-Jew due to conversion were simply not accepted. Once a Jew, always a Jew, no matter your beliefs or your actions. Some of the children came from affluent families, other from more modest backgrounds. The parents were lawyers, maids, teachers, carpenters, businessmen, doctors, mothers who ran households, whole variety. The children were both Jewish, had both Jewish and non-Jewish friends, and went to all variety of schools. A very small percentage, about 5%, were not Jewish, and these were children, mostly children of partisans and resistors who were in great danger. So at the same time that parents stood in long lines outside different embassies trying to get visas for their families to escape the Nazi persecution and the intense anti-Semitic violence that was on the streets every day, they also filled out applications to get their children onto the Kindertransports in a last choice effort to send them to safety. The application process was intense, and acceptance into the program was very competitive. Often parents saw no other opportunities to save their children, so they pushed hard to get them onto the transports. So how did they do it? Well, there were many steps. First, while the children waited to find out what would happen to them, the parents had to get permission for their children to leave the country from a formal committee, the Federal Representation of Jews in Germany, located in Berlin, or the Religious Jewish Community in Vienna, the Kultusgemeinde, or the Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization invested in helping the children. In Prague, parents petitioned the British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia, applying to the British Inter-Aid Committee Czech section. Then parents had to send an application and photo of each child in the group to the German provincial social worker, who then forwarded it to Berlin. They also had to sign a statement allowing the committee in Great Britain to look after their children, and they had to state the child's religion, but they were only given choices. It was Jewish, Orthodox, Jewish liberal, non-practicing Protestant, Catholic, or Quaker. The children also had to be examined by approved nurses to get the required health certificate. And this information was sent to London, and then the permits were sent back to Germany and submitted to the police. Once the children were identified, their parents or guardians were issued a travel date and departure details, usually only a few days away. You can imagine the intensity of those days waiting for the children to be picked up by the trains. So what could the children take with them? Only what they could carry, a small sealed suitcase with no valuables and only 10 marks. It's about $5 or less in today's cash at the time. Parents packed warm clothing, socks, pajamas. Most toys, books, and stuffed animals had to be left behind, but a few cherished dolls did make it on board. Photos of family became treasured possessions, religious objects as well. Some children, even though it was not allowed, traveled with jewels and other valuables sewn into their clothing. Sometimes parents couldn't bear to send their children away and put them on the train and took them off again. Sometimes, occasionally, even several times, until they made their ultimate decision. The infants included in the program were cared for by other children on the transport, some only 5 or 6 years of age. Most were total strangers, with babies thrust into their arms. Some were siblings, but others were no relation at all, not even the child and parents' friends. All the children had a cardboard tag around their neck with a number on the front and their name on the back. No one seemed to think the separation was forever. Parents hoped to be reunited with their children soon, either in England, where they might find jobs as maids or butlers, the most common way for Europeans to be allowed entry, or in America, or any country that would admit them, even if they had to promise to farm for 7 years, as in the Dominican Republic. So the first Kindertransport of 196 children left Germany on December 1st, 1938, just 3 short weeks after the devastation of Kristallnacht. Many of these children came from a Jewish orphanage in Berlin, which had been burned to the ground by the Nazis during Kristallnacht. The group was masterminded by an English woman named Florence Nackeville, who had spent several long weeks in Berlin, hassled by the Nazi police, gathering the children. This statue in Liverpool Street Station in London, maybe you've seen it, honors these children and all those who came afterward. They had traveled by train through Holland to what is known as the Hoek van Holland, a Dutch port, where they were given cups of hot chocolate and encouraged to cheer their freedom from the Reich. even though most of them were too traumatized to do so. They then took a ferry across the English Channel to Great Britain. The first group arrived in Harwich, England on December 2nd, one day after leaving home, and then were transported to London. The first train to leave Vienna departed on December 10th, 8 days later, with 600 children on it. The transport had been organized by a Dutch Christian woman named Dr. Gertrude Weissmuller, who rescued hundreds of children in the Holocaust and is actually honored at Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among nations. She had no children of her own, interestingly, even though she had a long and happy marriage. She had to negotiate directly with Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of Jewish immigration from Vienna to get the children out. A terrifying experience, she said. Dr. Weissmuller was originally turned away, but she persevered. Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, was as determined as Hitler to murder all of Europe's Jews, including the children, and he was not easy to convince. He ultimately agreed to give her the 600 children, with the clear intention of overloading her and thus making a transport on such short notice impossible. Nevertheless, she succeeded spectacularly. What could it have been like to leave home? So children who were to travel on the Kindertransport trains gathered at railway stations on the day of their departure to England. Several hundred children usually left together on a single transport. The Nazis ordered many of the transports to leave on Saturday, which forced observant Jews to break their religious laws and travel on Shabbat, violating their day of rest. On the train, before entering Holland, Nazi inspectors came on board and rummaged through the children's bags looking for anything valuable. They took away the children's watches and earrings and necklaces, anything they were wearing, especially those with Jewish stars. The escorts tried to stop them, but they couldn't. The escorts, the chaperones, were mostly the young Jewish men and women who volunteered to be the children's companions on the train and make sure that they arrived and were correctly handed off to the correct guardians at Liverpool Street Station, which you can see is a very intense, busy place where children could very easily get lost upon their arrival in London. And the chaperones were required to go right back to Germany as soon as they dropped the children off, and often were arrested on their return. Sadly, very few of them survived the Holocaust. You might wonder how the transport route was decided. Well, the Nazis decreed that they would only allow the Kindertransports to take place if they took a circuitous route that did not block any ports in Germany or interfere with their war effort in any way. So it was determined that the transports, the parties would go by train to the Netherlands, to Hoek van Holland, and then to the British port of Harwich from there, because they were both out of the Nazis' way. When the children reached Harwich, the port in England, where they were permitted to disembark, they were taken by train to London, and some were met by relatives or foster parents, while others were sent to hostels or convents or farms or group homes or schools until foster care could be arranged for them. Now, children without prearranged foster families were sheltered at temporary holding centers and transient stations at empty summer camps like Dovercourt and Pakefield. Some went to the Whittingham Farm School in East Lothian, Scotland, an estate that served as the family home of Arthur Balfour, a recognizable name, I'm sure, the former UK Prime Minister, and in 1917, the author of the Balfour Declaration, which promised support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, which was then an Ottoman region. Others were sent to the Mill Isle Farm refugee settlement in Northern Ireland, and overall, about half the children ended up living with foster families throughout the UK, and the other children were dispersed to many parts of the British Isles, including Wales. The many unsponsored children waited for individual families to come forward to take one or two of them into their homes. Those older than 14 were frequently absorbed into the country's labor force after a few weeks of training, mainly in agriculture or domestic service, along with attending school. So girls became nannies and maids, boys worked on farms or did factory work. Many organizations and individuals assisted in settling the children in the UK, as soon as they got off the ferry. These included the Refugee Children's Movement, B'nai B'rith, the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council, the YMCA, and the Society of Friends, and many others. Many private gifts of money and clothing were received to help the children to be as comfortable as possible, despite the newness of life in Great Britain and the shock of leaving home and parents. So what was life like for the children when they arrived in their new homes? Now, regardless of the child's personality, age, health, or natural ability to adapt, the experience was nearly always traumatic. Adjusting to the new foods, new dinner manners around the table, and different cultural expectations often proved overwhelming. Most of the parents back in Germany had explained the situation to their children in similar ways. You're going on an adventure, or it's just a short trip and we'll see you very soon. Very young children under the age of 6 or so usually would not accept such an explanation and would demand to stay with their parents. Those who had not yet developed a sense of time were unable to comprehend that they might see their parents again, and thus making the trauma of separation total from the very beginning. The children were fostered by people with a variety of religious, social, political, and economic and cultural backgrounds, many of which did not match the children's at all. Some were placed with non-Jewish families and soon became aware of different British social customs to which they had to adapt, even those that made no sense to them. Of course, many parents tried to join their children in Great Britain, and British newspapers were filled to overflowing with ads from people with their passports ready who were looking for work. Often they were upper-class Jewish Europeans who were so desperate to emigrate that they would accept any job, even domestic work or farm labor. But few were able to succeed. The children had left Germany and Austria with the sense that they would see their parents again soon. Hard as it was to part, nearly all left with the feeling that the separation was only temporary. But most of the parents knew better, even if they didn't say so. Having to learn a new language in a country where the child's native German was not understood was very stressful for the children. They had to learn to live with strangers who spoke only English and accept them as substitute parents. It's a huge leap. At school, the English children would often view the refugee children as enemy Germans instead of simply Jewish refugees. And the weather in England was rainy and foggy, and the children who arrived in the winter months suffered from the cold and the damp. British homes were not well heated, and bedrooms were always cold. Meals and snacks were very different from what the children had at home, especially the comfort food. The English drink tea, for example, and the children wanted the hot cocoa that they were used to. Older Kindertransport children would soon become fully aware of the war in Europe during the years they were in the UK, and many became very fearful for their parents. Communications grew from sporadic to non-existent once Great Britain and Germany were officially at war. Many of the children became aware of the Holocaust and the direct threat to their Jewish parents and extended family back home in Germany and Austria, and this added to the difficulty of their adjustment to their new life. Many of the children became aware of the Holocaust and the direct threat and suffered, like everyone else in Britain during the war years, to the terror of the Blitz. Bombs dropped on their homes and schools, and life in the cities became very dangerous. Soon, the schools in London arranged for some of the children to be evacuated to the countryside. Everyone was given a gas mask in the fear that the Germans would strike with poison gas as they had done in the Great War. Food was rationed. Butter, sugar, meat were scarce. Everyone received one single egg each week, as well as a piece of meat the size of a hamburger. Clothing was rationed, shoes, stockings, dresses, pants, shirts. The children were growing, but they couldn't get new clothes. The children had no choice but to accept the shortages. The Kindertransport children were alive and relatively safe, but few had the awareness in the midst of everything they lacked, including and especially the love and comfort of their parents, to appreciate their good fortune. Now, as the war progressed and fears of invasion rose among the British, refugees from Germany residing in Great Britain were increasingly seen as a security threat. Suddenly, the Kindertransport children were classified by the government as enemy aliens instead of Jewish refugees, despite their young age. In June 1940, following shifts in public opinion, Churchill ordered the internment of all male refugees from enemy countries who were between the ages of 16 and 70. And boys in this age group who had come to the Kindertransports were sent out of the UK to internment camps where they could do no harm to the British. These boys were they were the so-called friendly enemy aliens. It's an incongruous term, but it's the one that they used. Many of the children who had arrived in earlier years were now young men, so they were considered a threat to society. About 1,000 were sent to internment camps, many on the Isle of Man, an island off the British coast. About 400 were transported overseas to Canada and Australia. When the camp internees reached the age of 18, they were offered the chance to do war work or enter the Army Auxiliary Pioneer Corps. Despite their classification as enemy aliens or friendly enemy aliens, about 1,000 German and Austrian prior Kinder who had reached adulthood, meaning 18, went on to serve in the British Armed Forces, which now accepted these enemy aliens, including into combat units, and they fought in the war against Germany. It must have been a very complex psychological adjustment. Several dozen joined the elite formations such as the Special Forces, where their German language skills were put to good use, particularly during the Normandy landings and afterward as the Allies progressed into Germany, especially in interrogating POWs and interpreting the secret information the captured German soldiers were forced to divulge. The war finally ended, and everyone cheered. Well, everyone except this little girl who was probably crying about over all the noise. It was 1945, more than a full 6 years after the first children were sent to England, and most of the Kinder were now in their teens or above. They would have to find ways to figure out how to make their way in the world. But this was secondary to first getting critical information about their parents, as all the children looked forward to being reunited with the families they had left behind in Nazi-occupied countries. Virtually all the Kindertransport children wrote letter after letter to the Red Cross to find out what had happened to their families back home. It took a long time for them to learn whether their parents had survived the war years. Overall, there were great difficulties in Britain as the children from the Kindertransports tried to reunite with their families. Agencies were flooded with requests from the children to find their parents or any other surviving members of their family, and it was primarily the kind-hearted volunteers who worked tirelessly to find them. The International Red Cross gathered names of those who had survived the camps, as well as those who had been hidden by courageous Christians. New lists of survivors were posted every few days. The Red Cross was the repository for the vital information that the children were desperate to gain. Some of the luckiest children were ultimately able to reunite with their families, though often having to travel to far-off countries to do so. Overall, about 1/3 of the children who had left with the Kindertransport were united with at least one family member, but the other 2/3 learned sooner or later that both their parents had been murdered. Still, those who found their family often found it much harder than they had thought it would be after all their dreams of reuniting for all the years of the war. More than 6 years had passed since the children and parents had seen each other. Life in the UK had been very different from that of their families. The Kindertransport children had been sheltered and fed by their British hosts, while their parents had suffered hunger, cold, and terrible, unimaginable cruelties. Also, the children were no longer the little ones who had left home with the Kindertransports. The children often didn't even recognize their parents. They had suffered and aged, most behind barbed wire. Often they seemed like utter strangers. Many were sick and bent and broken in body and spirit. And for some of the children, the German language did not sound familiar. It sounded strange to their ears. Some even harbored resentment that their parents had sent them away, and it was often not an easy or happy experience to see them again. as the terrible feelings of rejection and abandonment came flooding back. But those were only the lucky ones who had found a parent. For the rest, they had to find a way to go on their own, to find jobs, possibly marry, start a family. But one good thing did happen to the children. They became eligible to become citizens of Great Britain. Many others emigrated to Israel, the US, Canada, and Australia. Their identities had changed so many times, from innocent refugee child to enemy alien, then to friendly enemy alien, to survivor, and then for many to citizen. The last transport out of Nazi-occupied Europe had left Germany on September 1st, 1939, the day Hitler's armies marched into Poland, and 2 days before England and France, honoring their commitment to defend Poland, declared war on Germany. It was the official start of World War II. The Kindertransport operation was shut down. It had run for less than a year, just a brief 9 months, but 10,000 children's lives had been saved. 10,000 children were taken to safety. 10,000 children who escaped the fate of the 1.5 million children who had been left behind and who perished in the Holocaust. For virtually all the children who had been saved through the Kindertransport, though, the trauma of their complex, intense experience of leaving home, adapting to a new country and a new culture, and then trying to bring together the remnants of those who were left of their families, there were scars too deep for most of us to even comprehend. As the years passed, some took comfort in the creation of two Kindertransport associations, one in the UK and one in the US, that even today continue to bring together survivors to share stories and keep their memories alive at exhibitions in museums all over the world, somewhat like this one. They also were together to create lectures and articles, books, films, and programs so that the world will always remember. In November 2018, for the 80th anniversary of the Kindertransport program, the German government announced they would make a payment of $2,800 to each of the kinder who were still alive. Here are the grown-up children who attended the reunion, along with their families, 1,000 people in all. Very beautiful. This payment, though only a token amount, of course, represents an explicit recognition and acceptance of the immense damage that had been done to each child in the war, both psychological and material, and brought some peace to the adults who were children at the time. The small financial token of reparation for those who suffered grievously is certainly a gesture worth appreciating, like this memory quilt, one of many, many sewn in the honor of the Kindertransport children. However, all it is, of course, is just the merest gesture. Yet for the rest of us, learning about the history of the transports, the 9 fleeting months in which they took place, and the 10,000 children who were saved, that knowledge can help us gain the admiration and respect most surely deserved for the people who lived through the Kindertransports and those who made it happen. I think we can best honor the Kindertransport children for their strength and resilience, and that of their brave and fearless parents, through the words of Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, at the time of the first Kindertransport reunion in 1989, 50 years after the children were sent out of the Nazis' reach. Here's what she said. I am pleased and proud that our government at the time offered you refuge and help after the dreadful persecution you suffered in Germany. You came to us as homeless children and grew up to enrich the life of this country with your courage and fortitude. And I thank each one of you. So I thank you for being such an attentive audience. And now I will get out of my screen share and I'll be happy to answer any of the questions.
Linda, thank you so much for your presentation. It was brilliant. You've really opened up a host of questions and comments that have been pouring in, talking about how your presentation has jogged many people's memories. I would like to ask some of these questions and make some comments that people have made. First of all, I just want you to know that we have attendees from Illinois, Atlanta, Boston, Spain, various parts of the UK. So it's great to have everybody here, and I'm grateful that you had the opportunity to hear Dr. Burghardt's presentation. One of the attendees' father was on the last Kindertransport out of
Oh,
Austria. We have a lot of attendees here who had family that were a part of the Kindertransport. So I'm going to ask a couple of the questions, many in common. So I'm going to kind of try to coalesce some of these things. One of the biggest questions was tracking down information and tracking down descendants of the relatives who took in
mhm,
the Jewish children.
mhm,
What are some of the best resources? I do want to say that there was a gentleman by the name of Mark who suggested the World Jewish Relief, and you also mentioned the Kindertransport associations.
mhm.
So, what is your advice in gaining some information, archived information about their family and about the people that took them in?
Yes, good question. So those are really the two best sources that were mentioned. One can also look at the Arelson archives, which are kept in Germany. They are accessible online, and that's an excellent source of information. And also the Shoah archives put together by Steven Spielberg, which are centered at the University of Southern California, USC, which is also sometimes called the University of Spoiled Children. Apologies if there are any alumni from there. And also the Fortunoff Archives in New Haven, run by Yale University, and they're accessible online and in person, and that's also a very good source.
Very good. A two-pronged question. How difficult was it to get your child onto the Kindertransport? Did it require some luck, a bribery, contacts? And why were some families resistant to send their children on
Mhm.
Kindertransport?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer the second part first. Families were resistant because they couldn't let go of their children. I can't imagine that. I have two aunts and uncles who had 8-year-old and 11-year-old children, and they were able to get out with their children. And I spoke to them afterward, and they said, we never would have been able to give our children away. But 10,000 sets of children and parents were able to do so. It was very competitive and difficult to get your child on the Kindertransport. You had to be ready. You had to be willing to say yes to whatever was asked of you. You had to make appointments with the Jewish relief agencies and show up with your children so they could be processed. Um, Most of the children who wanted to go were placed. A problem that came up were in family was that took place in families where there might have been 5 children or 6 children. Could they take all of them? And they didn't. They would usually take only 2. And that was extremely difficult for parents to then make a choice.
Wonderful. I do want to add that we have people from Canada who are now making it clear that they want to be heard, and people from New Jersey. So thank you so much for attending. The next question is, what about families that couldn't raise the 50 pounds? Were all the kids sponsored by other people, or did some of the families have to raise the 50 pounds?
Most of the children were sponsored. The Jewish relief agencies went into absolutely high gear to get
Mhm.
money for every child they were able to fit on the train. The parents mostly did not have to pay, thank goodness. So you could get a full range of children from all different economic circumstances.
Another question is there was rampant anti Semitism in the UK. How was this program so successful in light of the fact that that environment and
Mhm.
culture was so anti Semitic?
Apparently, the desire to save children overcame the prejudices that people were feeling. Everyone was terrified of war and felt extremely endangered. So the other thing that I came across numerous times was friends in high places, and I could never get to what they were. But there must have been people high up in the government who were not anti-Semitic, who were willing to take the chance and do this.
Mhm. Another suggestion was to reach out to Yad Vashem for
Ah,
information.
yes, excellent idea. Thank you.
Why didn't the United States accept the children?
Mm. Well, complicated answer since the bill never got out of committee, but it was a combination of fear, of isolationism, of willingness to stay out of Europe's war, anti-Semitism, and fear of bringing new children, new people into the US during a time of depression. It's not so different from today's immigration problems. Immigration is always, always, always a real problem. And the Americans do not want to see that the situation in Europe was as deadly as it was.
A gentleman asked about, I believe it was Kristallnacht, just before the Kindertransport. His grandfather was arrested. He was one of the 30,000 men that were arrested. I happen to know a little bit about that, and that some of these gentlemen that were arrested were businessmen. Some of the owners of the businesses that were actually burnt down. Do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
Oh, there were men of all stripes and colors and economic and cultural and religious circumstances. If you were Jewish and they found you, you were open to arrest. It was absolute havoc, is from what I've read and from what my parents told me. And if you were Jewish, you were endangered, and that was that.
Here's another good question. Did most of the kids keep their Jewish identities after?
Well, there have been a lot of studies. You can imagine how much these Kindertransport children were studied. The answer is no, sadly. The answer is that many of them gave up being Jewish because they saw no value to it, and they saw it endangered them and their families, and they couldn't accept religion in the kind of society they felt they were living in, probably close to half. And many of the ones who kept their religion became very religious. And so it can go either way. The pendulum swings, and people have very many different reactions. My parents remained Jewish after they emigrated, but they were very privately Jewish. They wouldn't put a mezuzah on the door. They were afraid of what it might mean, even in New York City, where we lived and where I grew up. Now, the Kindertransport children had tremendous trauma, additionally, because of their age. And many of them felt that it came from their religion, and they did not feel comforted by keeping their Judaism.
Somebody asked, is it possible to say something about the role played by Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, who is credited with the rescue of many, possibly thousands of Jews?
So I don't know that. I would have to look it up. I don't know that. If somebody who does know the answer wants to put it in the chat, that would be very helpful. I would like to know where he was from and how he managed this. So that's a wonderful story. Now, I'm assuming he was rescuing adults. So yes, Rabbi Schoenfeld, and what was the first name? Did we get a
Let's
first
see
name?
here. That was Solomon Schonfeld, Schonfeld.
Okay. All right. I will look that up and learn about it myself. But if somebody has some insight, that would be great.
I have some insight here. My mother left Vienna in January 1939 on a Kindertransport, and quite separately or by coincidence, worked in a nursery school set up by Rabbi Schoenfeld in Stamford Hill, London, in the 50s. Okay, very good.
Very interesting. Okay, good. That's a help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have maybe a couple more questions. If you'd like to answer some of them, it's up to you.
Sure, a couple more would be fine.
Let's see here. Okay, can you speak about the I can't pronounce this name, Kruas, Kruas, an American family that were able to rescue children and bring to the United States?
Oh, I don't know that. That's something else to look up.
There's so much. It's a bottomless pit of information.
It is. And well, of course, certainly the Holocaust, you could study your entire life and still only know a fraction, which is fortunately why so many of us are studying the Holocaust. And maybe we'll have some knowledge that we can share with each other. And I will look that up, Schoenfeld and Kruas. I've duly noted it.
And let's do one last question.
Okay.
Do you know how many kinder stayed in England after the war?
Yes. I think the statistic is 75%. They were allowed, as I said, to apply for citizenship, which was a wonderful thing. And they were comfortable. They knew the language. They had a society to be part of, and they felt welcomed. So it was a beautiful statement that Margaret Thatcher made, and she was really speaking to those who stayed.
Well, I'm afraid we're almost out of time, Linda. This was wonderful. You have a lot of comments here. Uh,
Good.
Everybody's grateful for being able to attend this program that you've put together so brilliantly. So thank you so much
Thank you.
for doing this on behalf of HMTC. So let's see here. I'd like to first of all thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge. And I look forward to hearing more of your presentations in the future. And for everyone else out there, I thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at some of our other programs. For those that live here in Long Island, we'd love to see you attend some of our programs right here in person. Otherwise, please make sure that you check out hmtcli.org. That's hmtcli.org. Click on the events tab for information about each one of our programs. Linda presents several programs during the month, so please make sure to check and see when she's going to be doing that next. And so thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful
Okay.
day, and God bless all of you.
Thank you, Bernie.
Bye bye.